Where are we supposed to find Jesus? That's like one of the recurring questions that the Gospels keep asking is, where should we look for Jesus? And they keep showing us Jesus in surprising kinds of places, right? The nativity story we tell on Christmas Eve, the Messiah, the promised Savior, is placed not in a palace, not in a rich man's mansion, not behind a fortress for the captain of the imperial guard, but in a borrowed food trough in not even his own family's house. We keep finding Jesus in unexpected places. And that becomes the same theme the Sunday after Christmas. The first Sunday of Christmas, we tell the story this year of Jesus when he's 12 years old and his family has gone to the temple in Jerusalem like a good, respectable Jewish family for a festival. And they're there in the city and the rest of the family caravan is going back home. And almost like in a scene from Home Alone, Mary and Joseph both assume that Jesus is just hanging out with friends. They're doing a head count in the van on the way, and they leave Jesus behind in the temple, not realizing that they left him behind. And they're searching with all their friends who've traveled with them, and Jesus isn't there. They go back to the city of Jerusalem, and lo and behold, they discover Jesus there in the temple talking with the religious experts and listening and asking them questions and challenging their faith and their understanding of God. And of course, Jesus' response is timeless. He says to his parents, "Why were you looking for me anywhere else? Wouldn't of course I have been here in my Father's house." It's this surprising story, and yet when you look back, you go, oh, well, yeah, it would make sense that if Jesus is God's own son, we would find Jesus in the place you associate with God's dwelling place, with God's house, God's being present in the temple. So there's a certain amount of, oh, yeah, it sort of makes perfect sense. And I think that's part of what's actually going on in this story, that Luke, the storyteller, is still laying the groundwork to make it clear to all of us that Jesus isn't just a random Palestinian Jew. Jesus isn't just going to be an interesting random rabbi. Jesus is God's promised Savior. Jesus is God's promised Messiah. And where Jesus is where God is, right? So Jesus literally goes to the temple, the place everybody associates with God's presence, as if to say, yeah, when you think God, think Jesus. When you think Jesus, think God. Where Jesus is where you go to meet God. And that's step one. Because the whole rest of Jesus' life is then going to be about the flip side of that wherever Jesus goes, he brings the very presence of God. And that's going to take Jesus, and therefore God, into all sorts of unexpected places a respectable deity isn't supposed to show up. Jesus is going to show up among the sick, bringing God's very presence, touching lepers and healing them. Jesus is going to go among outcasts and tax collectors, and therefore bringing God's presence to all those folks. Jesus is going to go across boundaries and borders to meet people on the margins and outside of his territory, in Gentile territory, across the sea and into other people's lands and territories. Jesus is going to come along not just with well-respectable religious teachers, but also the nobodies, the anybodies, the outcasts, and everybody in between. And eventually, of course, Jesus is headed to a God-forsaken cross, and of course the real scandal that Luke has been laying the groundwork here from the beginning is where Jesus goes, God goes. Whatever you associate with Jesus' location, yeah, that's God too. Luke starts us off making it clear that you find Jesus where you look for God, and conversely, you find God where you discover Jesus is, so that we will discover what kind of a God we really have, who doesn't just stay inside temple walls or in shrines made with human hands. But in fact, God has always been loose in the world, and Jesus sort of becomes the one who shows us God's presence in all the places you don't expect God to be. So come this Sunday, as we continue to celebrate the wonder, the joy, the good news of Christmas, of the incarnation, that God has come to be with us in Jesus, and that therefore wherever Jesus goes, even unexpected places, God goes. Maybe what we'll discover along the way is that when Jesus shows up in all those surprising locations, we'll look back and go, yeah, maybe it's not that surprising after all. Maybe this is exactly where we should have looked for Jesus and for God all along. See you Sunday.